So Gnosticism was one of the challenges of the first century in Christianity and spilled over into the second century. So we can think of it as a first/second century AD problem. So it's pronounced Gnosticism. The G is silent, and the word comes from the Greek word gnosis, and in ancient Greek, the G is pronounced. So this is a term that's used to refer to theosophical adaptations of Christianity. And Gnosticism was propagated by a dozen or more rival sects. So there wasn't a single Gnostic group, but they overall had a general characteristic, which we'll talk about. And they mostly came on the scene sometime between 80 AD and about 150 AD. So in terms of context, Jesus lived, let's say 4 BC to about 30 AD. The first New Testament writings were about 49 AD-ish, and the final New Testament writings were anywhere from 100 to 120 AD. That's the New Testament. So this just to give you a context. So the Gnostic problem, we can call it that, arose while the documents in the New Testament were still being written, and were very influential in the shaping of the New Testament. So you do have many New Testament writings responding explicitly to these Gnostic sects that had arisen. Now, Gnosticism was a major problem, immense problem in the early church, and it primarily sprang up among Gentile converts to Christianity. So by Gentiles, we mean non-Jews. And so, by a quick way of background, Christianity was primarily a Jewish sect. Okay, and that's really what it was. So 70 AD is when the temple is destroyed. The Jewish temple is destroyed. And there were two Jewish sects that survived the temple. That's because their general spiritual outlook was not tied to the temple. And so the group called the Nazarenes, which are Christians, they survived this destruction of the temple. They did just fine. And then a type of Judaism that was linked with the Pharisees also survived. So Judaism today is a product of this school of thought, and Christianity today is a product of the Nazarenes. So those are the two types of Judaism that survived. So the Gnostic sects were Gentile converts, okay, to this kind of Judaism. So there's something about Christianity that appealed to them. They loved it, and it's hard to speak of Gnosticism outside the context of Christianity. Okay, so I said the term Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, and that word means knowledge. And so these were people who viewed themselves as a spiritual aristocracy. Okay, so they saw themselves as a spiritual elite. And they claimed to have a more profound wisdom or some secret kind of knowledge, and also claimed to have deeper mystical experiences. Than others. So there are a few things about them. So they saw themselves as perfect, but fellow Christians as inferior. Okay, so they considered themselves superior to their fellow Christians. Okay, another very, very important thing about them is that they were dualists. Okay, so dualists, they believed essentially everything is split into two. Things can either be spirit or matter. Okay, so that's the world essentially dual. Existence is dual. There's spirit and there's matter. For them, spirit was everything. Okay, and then matter. So you had couple different categories of Gnostics. So for them, for some, matter was nothing, so it just was not real, or it was evil. Okay, and so these two views of matter led to different ways of living one's life in the world. So for those for whom matter was nothing, that means it's not real. It meant that physical acts, what you do in your body, were a matter of indifference. Okay, so it didn't really matter what you did with your body, because your body really was nothing. It's almost like you're living in, when you're in a virtual reality, or if you're playing a video game, and to some degree you feel like, well, whatever you do in that video game really is not real. So if you kill someone in that video game, you think, oh, well, that's not real. That's just simply a virtual reality type of situation. So for this, many took it as a license to act immorally. Okay. Excuse me. Now, for the other group, now for those who saw matter as evil, they adopted extreme ascetic practices. Okay, so just a definition here. Asceticism is a practice of self-discipline. Right, so when you live an ascetic life, that means you practice self-discipline, so you try to restrain your body from doing the things that it wants. So, for instance, if you decide you're going to live a celibate life, that's an ascetic life, right? Or you decide to fast, that's go without food, or restrict what you eat, that's an ascetic life. If you decide you don't want your body to be too comfortable, so you are going to not sleep on a comfortable bed, that's an ascetic life. So these Gnostics who believed that matter was evil felt like you had to discipline the body because it was evil. Okay, and so for them, they developed these very strong ascetic opinions and practices. And they even went as far as saying that married couples should refrain from sexual activity. So while in Christianity, the idea of refraining from sexual activity voluntarily was not frowned upon. Right? Some people decide to do that. And Jesus famously said, "Whoever can bear to do it, do it. If it's not that big a deal." But there was nothing against sexual activity in among married people in Christianity. But for the Gnostics, there were. They considered the body evil. So any of the body's urges or desires was also evil. Now, Gnostics in general also rejected as crude, okay, the Hebraic, and what I mean by that, just the Hebrew doctrine of the resurrection of the body. So Christianity, among its central claims is that Christ rose from the dead. And this he did so bodily, right? He rose from the dead, so physically rose from the dead, and that he ascended to heaven physically, and that that Christians will rise again bodily. Okay, and so the Gnostics rejected the resurrection because, of course, it's basically promising your body back. And for them, they see the body as either not real or evil. And so they just saw it as a vestige of Hebrew doctrine that was just simply not correct. Okay, and so they preferred the Platonic doctrine, so Plato's doctrine or idea of the immortality of the soul. Okay, so the idea that the soul was indestructible and it lived forever, right? So the Gnostics prefer that. So they saw, I guess, like many Platonists, that when you died, your body simply disintegrated, but your soul lived on, right, and it lived on forever. And so they prefer that and rejected the resurrection of the body. Right? They felt that for them, the resurrection added nothing. And now you notice that today in Christianity, this is a very real issue, right? The question about the resurrection, especially with the idea that when one dies and one's soul goes to heaven, then the question does come up. Well, what would be the purpose of the resurrection of the body if you're already in heaven, experiencing heaven with your soul? So this Gnostic idea that was rejected. Let me rephrase that. So the Gnostic idea of preparing the immortality of the soul to resurrection of the body, it hasn't necessarily gone anywhere. It's still very much around. But the emphasis in Christianity has always been that soul, if the soul is immortal or not, that's neither here nor there. The bottom line is that there is going to be a resurrection from the dead, and it's going to be bodily. Okay, so that's central, and that remains central to Christianity. Okay, now the in the second century of Christianity, so we said Gnosticism, of course, was still going strong. So you had a particular set that's of interest to us. So I just want to outline a couple of things that they believed. So you had Gnostic sects that claimed that they possessed special knowledge, gnosis. Okay, so they claimed special gnosis. So they believe that in Christians there is a divine spark. And this divine spark becomes imprisoned in matter and has lost its memory of its true heavenly home. So the idea of the Gnostic gospel is to sort of awaken the soul and help the soul become aware of its own high destiny, right? And so begin to realize that this world matter is evil or it's nothing, and it needs to go back and seek its true home, which is in heaven. Of course, they emphasize that the present material world was utterly alien to God and evil. Okay, so they saw matter as evil. Again, I just make a quick point here that in the book of Genesis, okay, there's a very different story about how God feels about the world. God loves the world, right? In its material form, right? So God loves the world. God loves matter. In fact, after God creates everything, God looks and God calls the world very good. Right. So in the Hebrew, let's say / Jewish tradition, matter was never a problem. Matter was good. Okay, so the general biblical approach to matter was one like matter, human experiences, history were a good thing, and they would not have accepted this idea that the world was evil. So because of the Gnostics' attitude towards matter, they rejected the idea of the incarnation. At least in its genuine form. So the incarnation is the fact that the pre-existent logos, or the pre-existent word, who was with God. Okay, so there's a distinction with God. So it's a distinct entity. Becomes human. Okay, so the Gnostics of the of the first century and second century rejected this idea of a genuine incarnation. So their interpretation is that the divine Christ might have appeared, okay, to those without gnosis, without this special knowledge, as a tangible human. Okay, so if you weren't enlightened, you thought he was a human being. Okay, but those with gnosis, those with that special insight, they saw him as Christ as pure spirit. Okay, and Christ's physical appearance so his physical appearance was a mere optical illusion. Okay, and a mere semblance. Okay, and the Greek word there is dokesis. Okay, so these people who felt that that Christ's physical appearance was an optical illusion or semblance, okay, and we use the word dokesis. These were called, we call them now the Docetists. And that view is Docetism. Okay, so they couldn't handle the idea that the the logos, as it says in John, became human. Right? They couldn't handle that. This is the incarnation. So they believed it was simply an appearance. So the entire life of Christ for them, the incarnation, his preaching, his suffering, his death, burial, resurrection, okay, and ascension, all of which his body is central to every single one of these things. For all that, for them, it's all an optical illusion, right? He didn't really suffer. He wasn't really here in a material form preaching. He wasn't really incarnated. He wasn't really dead or buried. He certainly didn't need to rise because he didn't really have a body, and ascending into heaven was abhorrent to them. Okay, so the Docetists just would have rejected the genuine tangibility of all of these central moments in the life of Christ. Okay. And so Christianity clearly in the New Testament rejects Gnosticism. So this is a term that we use. We describe Gnosticism, but they had different ways of trying to identify them. And so in the New Testament, the Christian writers emphasize the humanity of Jesus and the tangibility of Jesus, the goodness of the world. And also with time, this is where the emphasis on Mary begins to emerge, right? The idea that he was born of a woman into the world and is thus a human being. And so, Mary became an object of devotion for various reasons, but theologically, she became central to protect the humanity of Jesus, to show that he was human. And this is why Mary it emerges in the creed, and then theologically begins to gain a lot of theological traction.